everyone, my name is Julianna, and today Daniela and I will be speaking about grief. Before we begin, we will just do a land acknowledgement, and this is for Toronto, where the Dish with One Spoon territory is located, as well as X University. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Our agenda for today will include the following: a brief introduction, and then we'll go into what is grief, the causes of grief, grief reactions, what are the stages of grief, criticisms of the stages of grief, as well as grief versus mourning. Then I will hand it over to Daniela, who will go over what is complicated grief, grief and mental health, misconceptions about grief, coping with grief, supporting a loved one, supporting a client, resources, as well as the important points to remember about this video. Losing a loved one or coming to terms with a terminal illness they are experiencing is something almost everyone will experience in their lifetime. Grief is a normal and natural process after loss, but it can be very painful to work through. You often hear the phrase, "time heals all wounds," and this is somewhat true for grief and loss. While you may still experience sadness at times, you eventually become better at managing your feelings and thoughts. Grief can be defined as a strong and sometimes overwhelming emotion that someone usually experiences after the loss of a loved one or from a terminal diagnosis they or someone they love has received. Grief is a universal and personal experience. Individual experiences of loss include the death of a loved one, the ending of an important relationship, job loss, loss through theft, or even the loss of independence through disability. It is important after experiencing a loss to realize that you cannot control the process and you should prepare for varying stages of grief. In addition to this, speaking to others about how and why you are feeling this way can help resolve issues that cause significant emotional pain, such as feeling guilty for a loved one's death. Grief is not something that goes away overnight. In fact, it can last for months or even years. Generally, the pain you feel immediately after a loss is relieved as more time passes, and you are able to adapt to life without your loved one, or coming to terms with the terminal diagnosis and recognizing they soon may pass. Grief is the name given to our emotional reactions to the deaths of loved ones. In a wider sense, grief is increasingly used to refer to our emotional reactions to any significant loss. This is not just loss due to death, as we discussed previously. This can also include loss of a job, romantic breakup, loss of a friendship, dream, or way of life. And recently, pandemic-related disruptions have also been associated with a form of grief. Grief is the way we react to loss in our life and can affect us in many different ways, such as changing our way of thinking, our emotions, behaviors, and how we physically feel. Different people experience loss and grief differently, but grief reactions can include the following: shock, disbelief and confusion, anger, trouble focusing and concentrating, altered patterns of thinking, sleeping, and eating, physical changes in the body such as dizziness, headaches, and nausea, sadness or yearning, memories and thoughts about who or what has been lost, and withdrawal from usual activities. The 5 stages of grief is a theory developed by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who suggests that we go through 5 distinct stages of grief after the loss of a loved one. Most professionals agree that there are 5 stages, although some argue there are 7 or some completely disagree with these 5 stages. These 5 stages developed by Kubler-Ross include denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. To begin, denial helps us to minimize the overwhelming pain of loss we first experience as part of the process. When we process the reality of our loss, we are also trying to survive through the emotional pain that it has caused. Denial happens because it can be very hard to believe we have lost an important person in our lives, especially if the death is sudden or unexpected. Anger is next. It is common to also experience anger after the loss of a loved one, as we are trying to adjust to a new reality and we are likely to experience extreme emotional discomfort during this time. There are many different emotions to experience and so much to process, but anger allows us an emotional outlet. Anger is somewhat more socially acceptable to admit rather than admitting you feel vulnerable and scared. However, anger can often make you feel isolated in your experience of loss, as you can be perceived as unapproachable by others in moments when you could benefit from comfort, connection, and reassurance. The next stage is bargaining. It is not unusual to feel so desperate after losing someone that you will do anything to alleviate or minimize the pain you are feeling. Loss causes us to consider any way we can avoid the current pain we are experiencing or the pain we are anticipating to occur. Bargaining can come in a variety of promises or offers, including, God, if you can heal this person, I will turn my life around. I promise to be a better person if you let this person live. I'll never get angry again if you can stop him or her from dying or leaving me. Often when we are bargaining, it is to a higher power, as we feel this may be able to influence the outcome of our request. Bargaining often occurs because it gives us a perceived sense of control over something that feels so out of control. It is common to look back at these desperate moments and wish we did not say the things we did, or we wish we could go back and behave and react differently to these moments. Next is depression. Depression occurs once the reality hits and we realize the person we lost is gone and nothing can be done about it. During this time, we are faced with what is happening around us, and bargaining no longer feels like an option. Also during this time, we start to feel the loss we are experiencing without the idea being clouded by panic and denial. During this time, you may also find yourself retreating, being less sociable, and reaching out less to others. This is a very natural stage of grief, and dealing with depression after the loss of a loved one can be extremely isolating, so it is important to reach out to others during this time for support. Lastly, there's acceptance. During this time, we come to a place of acceptance. This does not mean that you no longer feel the pain of the loss, but instead are no longer resisting the reality of your situation. Sadness and regret can still be present during this time, but the emotional survival tactics of denial, bargaining, and anger are less likely to be present. There has been some criticism of Kubler-Ross's work, although her 5 stages of grief have been widely accepted by the general public, taught in educational institutions, and used in clinical practice. When presented with the following statement, the process of grief can be expected to progress through a predictable series of stages, starting with denial and ending with acceptance. As many as 30% of the general public believed this was definitely true, compared with only 8% of mental health professionals. Another 38% of the general public believed this statement was only somewhat true. Various authors have criticized the model and argue about the model's representativeness of grief. This is based on the fact that the model is based on interviews with terminally ill patients, rather than individuals experiencing a loss. Therefore, this means that making any claim that the 5 stages are inevitable for bereaved people are unfounded. Many others have also drawn attention to the many ways that the model misrepresents the grieving process, such as assuming that all bereaved people will reach the final stage of acceptance. Because of this, in 2005, Kubler-Ross herself stated that the stages are not linear, and not everyone goes through all the stages or in a prescribed order. Although grief and mourning are often associated with each other, there are some differences. Grief is what we think and feel on the inside when someone we love dies, such as fear, loneliness, panic, pain, yearning, anxiety, and emptiness. It is the internal meaning given to the experience of loss, while mourning, on the other hand, is the outward expression of our grief or the expression of one's grief. We mourn by talking, crying, journaling, or letter writing, using art or music as a means of expressing our grief. Mourning a death is not always easy. As a society, we tend to be uncomfortable with outward expressions of grief, and we sometimes feel ashamed or weak if we show our innermost feelings. Yet the truth is, it takes strength and perseverance to mourn.
Now we'll continue with what is complicated grief. Some people may experience complicated grief, where the individual's grief responses do not lessen over time and they will still struggle to go back to normal routines. It's defined by certain characteristics, including anger or periods of strong rage, the individual only focusing on their loss, avoiding reminders of their loss or only focusing on them, strong feelings of sadness, emptiness, hopelessness, and low self-esteem, risky behaviors such as substance abuse or suicidal ideation. There are also factors that can lead to complicated grief, including delayed grief, which is the grief response being postponed, and this can be done without realizing it, or it can be intentional, such as postponing to make funeral arrangements or because they want to support someone else. There's also disenfranchised grief, where the individual feels they cannot grieve openly due to different pressures. This can include miscarriages or stillbirth, or a death related to HIV or AIDS. Due to this, the individual may feel they cannot grieve around others, and they may need to delay it, or they can only grieve privately. And finally, there's traumatic grief. This happens when there is a violent death or an unexpected death. This can also lead to stronger reactions or PTSD. However, with this in mind, everyone experiences grief differently, and there is no timeline for grieving. But if these responses to grief persist or get worse, it can be beneficial to talk to a mental health professional. Grief and mental health. Grief can lead to many negative feelings and impact mental health. When grief becomes chronic, it can lead to mental illness. Common warning signs of this includes sadness over a long period of time, the individual cannot stop focusing on grief, avoiding daily responsibilities, a lack of motivation to socialize, isolation from loved ones, trouble accepting loss even after long periods of time, and strong emotions such as anger towards loss. Some studies have shown that grief can lead to depression, but often symptoms subside over time. In some more rare occurrences, grief has resulted in psychosis. There is not much research on this, however, from what does exist, it's evident that these conditions are underlying and grief results in the onset of symptoms. When grief results in depression, it can lead to risky behaviors that can cause harm, such as through substance misuse. When this occurs and substances are used to cope with grief, it can lead to a substance abuse disorder. There may be various reasons why mental illness occurs after grief, including an underlying mental illness that was exacerbated by grief, genetic predispositions to mental illness, difficulties coping with grief in a healthy way, substance misuse and abuse, and alterations in the brain after grief that lead to mental illness. Misconceptions about grief. There are 4 types of misconceptions, including those about time, pain, remaining strong, and getting over it. Misconceptions about time include, with time you should be over it, and time heals everything. As discussed, time does not make grief go away, as the loss will stay with the individual. While grief responses will begin to lessen and the individual will learn to live with the grief and how it changed them, they will never be over the loss. Next is misconceptions about pain, such as avoid it and it can't hurt you, crying won't help, talking about it will make it worse, and getting angry will make it worse. These are harmful, as avoiding feelings of grief will actually worsen responses, and feelings and emotions are a natural part of grieving. It's important to talk about grief and find supports that will help. Misconceptions about remaining strong include, I shouldn't bother other people with my grief. This is often an internalized misconception, but by having people to turn to, individuals will find themselves supported, and this can be critical to the grieving process. Finally, misconceptions about getting over it include, if I don't get over it, I will never be happy, and if I find myself happy again, I would be dishonoring them. It's impossible to get over grief, as the loss and grief will stay with time. It will only get easier to live with the loss and heal. As well, when people do find themselves happy again after a grief, it can be a way to honor the individual who has passed. Coping with grief. There are various ways that individuals can cope with grief, including finding social support. Reaching out to loved ones can be helpful to cope with grief. It'll provide the support to go out or stay in and talk about how you're feeling, or spend time with them doing an enjoyable activity. Joining a support group. Joining a support group of individuals who are also grieving can be helpful. It'll provide a space and group of people with similar lived experiences who will understand what you're going through and be able to provide advice and support. Some individuals have also found it helpful to turn to religion for comfort. Finding your meaning or purpose. For instance, some individuals have found that starting charities after experiencing grief have been beneficial. Self-care. Self-care can be a very important step, and its definitions can range from person to person. Staying in and watching movies, going out for walks, doing a loved activity, or even waking up in the morning and drinking water and ensuring you eat enough can all be methods of self-care. Routines. With grief, it can be difficult to maintain routines, but it's an important step in coping with grief. By having designated meal and snack times, going out for walks, or having a sleep schedule, it can help to maintain a routine that will be beneficial over time. These are all important, as people who are grieving can experience insomnia or a lack of appetite, but by maintaining a routine, it can help to give you what you need. If grieving occurs over a long period of time or symptoms get worse, or you just wish to reach out to a professional, it can also be beneficial to talk to a therapist who can provide tools for coping and a safe space to discuss and work on grief. Supporting a loved one. There is a list of ways to support someone experiencing grief, including: don't avoid using their names. It can be more harmful to avoid using the name of the loved one they lost, and many people benefit from talking about the deceased individual. Avoid "how are you" or "I'm sorry for your loss." While well-intentioned, these phrases can be tiring to hear, as often the individual is not doing well, and "I'm sorry for your loss" is always said. Instead, ask how they're feeling today or if there is anything they need or want to talk about. Provide hope. People who are grieving might often find themselves feeling hopeless, so it's important to offer hope without seeming too hopeful. Using statements that acknowledge that grieving takes time but things will get better can be the most validating and hopeful for the individual. Reach out. Offering support by calling or texting can be beneficial and make them feel less alone. Helping out. Instead of asking what they need, since the individual might say nothing, it can be helpful to mention that you'll bring them food, come over to help with the dishes, help with funeral arrangements, or anything else that may help the individual. Listen instead of problem solving or giving advice. By listening and validating, it can provide comfort instead of making someone distance themselves. Remain judgment-free. Without experiencing grief, it can be difficult to understand how it impacts someone. Therefore, it's critical to remain judgment-free when someone reaches out. It's also critical to ensure that you center listening, validating, and showing empathy where you can. But most important, establish boundaries and take care of yourself as well. Supporting a client. There are several methods and techniques that can be used to support a client through grief and give them the appropriate tools. The first being cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. This is where clients will learn how to acknowledge negative thinking patterns and work on changing them by providing healthy ways to think and cope with stressors. CBT specifically focuses on cognitive reframing and restructuring, which makes clients aware of negative thought patterns and helps to work through them; targeting behaviors, which acknowledges harmful behaviors and providing healthy ones; and finally, it creates new narratives surrounding loss. The next technique is acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. This focuses on learning to accept negative feelings and work to cope with them in healthy ways. It uses mindfulness and can help to provide the opportunity for people to process grief. Traumatic grief therapy provides a space to work through sudden traumatic grief. It observes trauma responses and the type of grief that is connected to traumatic losses. Complicated grief therapy, or CGT. Here, clients learn to acknowledge the symptoms of complicated grief, and it also includes practices from ACT. Group therapy. This consists of having a group of individuals with similar lived experiences meet to share and talk about their feelings. It can have positive impacts on clients coping with grief, as it provides a safe space to share feelings, and it can forge connections with group members. Art therapy. It uses creativity to process grief. It's based on the idea that art and creativity can have positive impacts on well-being, and it can include painting, drawing, sculpting, making collages, or other creative means. Finally, play therapy. This is often used for children and involves having children use their imaginations or other forms of play to process grief, while providing a safe space to share their feelings. This is evident to greatly benefit children's well-being when experiencing grief. Now we'll go over resources. The most important thing to take away from this video is that there's supports and help available. For an immediate mental health crisis, reach out to a crisis line for support. For non-immediate mental health support, a useful resource is For a Safer Space. For a Safer Space is a nonprofit that offers accessible and inclusive mental health care. Visit the website for more information if you would like to reach out for support. We will conclude this video with some important points to remember. The first being that grief is a normal and natural process after loss, but it can be very painful to work through. Grief is defined as a strong, sometimes overwhelming emotion that someone usually experiences after the loss of a loved one or from a terminal diagnosis they or someone they loved has received. People experience grief differently, but there are many different types of grief reactions that can change ways of thinking, behaving, emotions, and physical feelings. 5 stages of grief were proposed, including denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These 5 stages have undergone criticism for its representations of grief. There are differences in grief and mourning, and grief without mourning can be dangerous and destructive to your physical, emotional, and spiritual self. While grief is caused by someone passing away, grief can also be experienced through situations such as the loss of a job or a romantic breakup. To continue with some important points to remember, complicated grief occurs when an individual's grief responses do not lessen over time and they still have difficulties resuming normal routines. Grief has large impacts on mental health and can occasionally result in the onset of mental illness. There are various misconceptions around grief, particularly surrounding time, pain, remaining strong, and getting over it, all of which cause harm. There are ways to cope with grief that can be beneficial, however, if needed, it can always be helpful to talk to a professional. There are many methods to support a loved one who is grieving, but ensure self-care and boundaries are met. And finally, there are various techniques that professionals can use to help a client cope with grief. That concludes this presentation on grief. Thank you for watching.